For 74 years, every facet of Soviet Russia had been meticulously controlled by the government. Now, the new free Russia, in its baby steps, was in dire chaos with the sudden disappearance of the iron hand that had ruled its population in the past. With little money in the banks, no government salaries, no more jobs, and scant food in the stores, it became every man for himself, just for survival. The Russian people were no strangers to surviving in the harshest possible conditions, and with the ingenuity that only emerges from necessity, it wasn't long before every commercial opportunity was being explored. The Soviet government had always depicted Russian caviar as one of the USSR's greatest natural resources. The Russian delicacy had been on the watch list of the KGB since the early 1980s. But with the dismantling of this powerful and feared organization, suddenly and rapidly, the world was flooded with cheap and low-quality Russian caviar. The Caspian Sea sturgeon and its caviar that had been so specially favoured by the Russian Orthodox Church and later made into a legendary industry by Peter the Great, was in major danger of total depletion. Fishermen in all parts of the Caspian Sea and on the Volga River would continue to harvest the great sturgeon as they had done for generations. The inefficiency of the new Russian government in the first years following the Soviet collapse made it easy for the Caspian fishermen to continue their trade undisturbed. And the world, blindfolded to the ecological consequences, was eager for the new cheap and too often badly produced Russian caviar. Later, when the Russian government attempted to take control of the Caspian Sea fishing industry, it was faced with syndicates of fishermen who had formed themselves into heavily armed gangs, protecting their newfound freedom and black gold. Caviar sold in the West could now fetch over 100 times the amount achieved domestically. One single large beluga fish containing 100 kilos of caviar could bring in more money than any Russian fisherman and his entire family would make in a lifetime. The traditional global caviar trade was now so fearful for the survival of its centuries-old business that it alerted the United Nations to establish protection for the great Caspian sturgeon. CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, is an agreement between world governments to ensure that global trading of certain species does not threaten their survival. At the end of the 20th century, it annexed to its convention the 27 world species of sturgeon, which included the Caspian species. A new hope for the survival of this majestic creature and its noble roe had emerged. News of the United Nations protection of the sturgeon echoed around the world, and the press and various wildlife protection agencies were soon to depict the Caspian Sea poachers and the lavish lifestyle of the West as the culprits for the sturgeon's potential demise. The fact that the Soviet Union had been overfishing the sturgeon for the past 50 years was often overlooked. World prices of caviar soared to totally unprecedented levels. This only served to fuel the poachers and their illicit organizations with even more willpower and weaponry to protect their new industry. The Caspian Sea had become a battlefield. The great sturgeon, its victims of war. Poachers, warlords, and sometime corrupt law enforcement officers were all fighting each other to rule supreme in the new and treacherous caviar trade. Often their hostilities were deployed with sophisticated military tactics. The 5 countries presiding over the Caspian Sea, with their often conflicting political agendas, encountered increasingly insurmountable obstacles blocking a common objective for the sustainability of the Caspian sturgeon. With the now fast acceleration in the decline of the Caspian Sea sturgeon stocks, and the complete failure of the Caspian countries to reach a consensus fishing policy, in 2008 and 2009, the Caspian sturgeon and its caviar were prohibited exports for the first time since the creation of the first sturgeon fishing office in the Russian city of Astrakhan in 1694. However, the final chapter of the most celebrated culinary delicacy in the world had not yet been written. A new and sustainable caviar industry had suddenly emerged. From the rubble of political differences, uncontrolled harvesting, and tactics of war in the Caspian Sea during the 1990s, sturgeons had been successfully raised in captivity in France. A new and sophisticated art of farmed caviar was entering the world culinary stage.